Meditations. Introduction. States will never be happy until rulers become philosophers or philosophers become rulers. Plato, The Republic. The ruler of the Roman Empire for almost 2 decades and author of the immortal Meditations. Book 1 offers glimpses of Marcus's schooling. For training in Greek rhetoric, he was entrusted to Herod's Atticus. The first book of the Meditations pays tribute to a number of philosophers from whom Marcus learned, both formally and informally. On August 31, 161, Antoninus died, leaving Marcus as his sole successor. Pushing through the appointment of his adopted brother, Lucius Verus, as co-regent. Ancient sources, in particular the gossipy Historia Augusta, tend to paint him as a self-indulgent degenerate, almost another Nero. This may be unfair, it is certainly not the picture of him we get from Marcus's own reminiscences in the Meditations. Much of his time was spent fielding problems that had moved up the administrative ladder. One of Marcus's priorities was to preserve good relations with the Senate. The goal was to disguise the absoluteness with which the emperor ruled, to preserve a facade and sometimes, no doubt, even to achieve the reality of consensus and cooperation. The Christians. In the course of the next century they would become an increasing problem for the imperial administration, and they were prominent enough in Marcus's day to attract an extended denunciation. Christianity had been illegal since the early 2nd century prompted the Emperor Trajan to establish a formal policy, while Christians were not to be sought out, those who confessed to the faith were to be executed. The main threat to Christians in the 2nd century came from individual provincial governors, acting either on their own initiative or under pressure from local communities. Marcus's mentor Junius Rusticus had tried and executed Christians, the apologist Justin Martyr among them, in his capacity as city prefect. Marcus, in any case, had more serious concerns than this troublesome cult. In 162 forces occupied Armenia and wiped out a Roman garrison that had gone to the rescue. Syria itself was threatened. Rome had no choice but to respond. Marcus had any military experience to speak of, Antoninus's peaceful reign had given little scope for it, and the day-to-day conduct of the war was no doubt left to the professionals. Avidius Cassius forced the Parthians to sue for peace. Parthia would remain a threat, but one that could be dealt with by diplomatic means for the immediate future. Within a year the empire was in the grip of a devastating plague, apparently brought back from the east by Lucius's troops. It delayed the emperor's response to a second threat. Rome's reaction alternated between aggressive resistance and attempts at accommodation. Its failure to develop a workable policy would eventually result in the collapse of the Western Empire some 3 centuries later. Rome still remembered the catastrophe of AD 9, when the Roman general Varus and 3 legions had marched into the forests of Germany, never to return. In Marcus's day 3 peoples presented a special problem, the Quadi, the Marcomanni, and the Jazyges, also called Sarmatians. The removal of 3 legions to Parthia had seriously weakened the Roman position on the northern frontier, and barbarians took advantage of the situation. In 168, Marcus and Verus marched north to deal with them. The reign would be spent on intermittent warfare, first in the so-called Marcomannic Wars of the early 170s and then in a second campaign later in that decade. And most of the burden was to be borne by Marcus alone, for Verus died suddenly, apparently of a stroke, in early 169. Romans had to negotiate with individual chieftains whose authority was limited and whose reliability was always in doubt. When negotiation failed, the only alternative was a slow and bloody succession of small-scale engagements rather than pitched battles. The progress of the campaign is recorded on the column erected in Rome to commemorate the close of the Marcomannic Wars. Paint a grim picture of brutal fighting, devastation, and execution. By 175 the Romans seemed to have gained the upper hand. But Avidius Cassius, who had distinguished himself as a general during the Parthian War and who as governor of Syria now served as virtual regent of the Eastern Empire, had revolted and declared himself emperor. Some of the eastern provinces, notably Cappadocia, remained loyal to Marcus, but Cassius was recognized as emperor throughout much of the east, and in particular in Egypt, whose grain supply was crucial to the capital. Civil war seemed inevitable, and was prevented only by Cassius's assassination at the hands of a subordinate. Marcus was nevertheless obliged to travel east to reassert his authority, taking with him Faustina. He visited the major cities of the east, Antioch and Alexandria, arriving finally at Athens, where he was initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries, a set of mystic rites connected with the worship of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture. Now in his 50s, Marcus was in declining health, and the revolt of Cassius had only underlined the need to make arrangements for the succession. By the mid-170s, his son Commodus, just entering his teens. He was consul in 177 at the age of 15. In the same year he was accorded all the major imperial privileges, except for the post of Pontifex Maximus, the head of the Roman state religion, held by the reigning emperor alone, and for life. The gains of the Marcomannic Wars had not proved permanent, and in 178, Marcus and Commodus marched north again. 2 years later Marcus died at age 58. Sadly, Commodus's performance did not bear out whatever promise Marcus had discerned in him. He was to be remembered as a dissolute tyrant, a second Caligula or Nero whose many defects were only emphasized by the contrast with his father. His assassination after a 12-year reign would usher in the first in a series of power struggles that would burden the empire for the next century. Philosophical background. The composition of the Meditations is normally dated to the 170s Marcus's last decade. In the 10 years between 169 and 179 he had to cope with constant fighting on the frontier, the abortive revolt of Cassius, and the deaths of his colleague Verus, his wife, Faustina, and others. He may have suspected that his son and successor, Commodus, was not the man he hoped. That in these circumstances Marcus should have sought consolation in philosophy is only natural. To understand the Meditations in context, we must familiarize ourselves not only with Stoicism, the philosophical system that underlies the work, but also with the role of philosophy in ancient life more generally. Today philosophy is an academic discipline, one that few people other than professional philosophers would consider central to their everyday existence. The careers of 20th century analytic philosophy often seem remote from what the American philosopher Thomas Nagel terms mortal questions, the problems involved in making ethical choices, constructing a just society, responding to suffering and loss, and coming to terms with the prospect of death. Indeed, most of us would be inclined to see these issues as the province of religion rather than philosophy. Ancient philosophy had a more practical dimension. It was not merely a subject to write or argue about, but one that was expected to provide a design for living a set of rules to live one's life by. This was a need not met by ancient religion, which privileged ritual over doctrine and provided little in the way of moral and ethical guidelines. Philosophy in the modern sense is largely the creation of one man, the 5th century BC. Athenian thinker Socrates. But it is primarily in the Hellenistic period that we see the rise of philosophical sects, promulgating coherent belief systems that an individual could accept as a whole and which were designed to explain the world in its totality. Of these Hellenistic systems the most important, both for Romans in general and for Marcus in particular, was the Stoic school. The movement takes its name from the Stoa, porch or portico, in downtown Athens where its founder, Zeno, 332-3, 262 BC, taught and lectured. Zeno's doctrines were reformulated and developed by his successors, Cleanthes, 331-232 BC, and Chrysippus, 280, c. 206 BC. Chrysippus in particular was a voluminous writer, and it was he who laid the foundations for systematic Stoicism. This early academic Stoicism is the source of certain key terms and concepts that reappear frequently in the meditation. Stoicism. That the world is organized in a rational and coherent way. More specifically, it is controlled and directed by an all-pervading force that the Stoics designated by the term logos. The term, from which English logic and the suffix logi derive, has a semantic range so broad as to be almost untranslatable. At a basic level it designates rational, connected thought whether envisioned as a characteristic, rationality, the ability to reason, or as the product of that characteristic, an intelligible utterance or a connected discourse. Logos operates both in individuals and in the universe as a whole. In individuals it is the faculty of reason. On a cosmic level it is the rational principle that governs the organization of the universe. In this sense it is synonymous with nature, providence, or God. When the author of John's Gospel tells us that the word logos was with God and is to be identified with God, he is borrowing Stoic terminology. All events are determined by the logos, and follow in an unbreakable chain of cause and effect. Stoicism is thus from the outset a deterministic system that appears to leave no room for human free will or moral responsibility. Attempted to get around the difficulty by defining free will as a voluntary accommodation to what is in any case inevitable. According to this theory, man is like a dog tied to a moving wagon. If the dog refuses to run along with the wagon he will be dragged by it, yet the choice remains his, to run or be dragged. In the same way, humans are responsible for their choices and actions, even though these have been anticipated by the logos and form part of its plan. Even actions which appear to be and indeed are immoral or unjust advance the overall design, which taken as a whole is harmonious and good. They, too, are governed by the logos. But the logos is not simply an impersonal power that governs and directs the world. It is also an actual substance that pervades that world, not in a metaphorical sense but in a form as concrete as oxygen or carbon. In its physical embodiment, the logos exists as pneuma, a substance imagined by the earliest Stoics as pure fire, and by Chrysippus as a mixture of fire and air. Pneuma is the power, the vital breath that animates animals and humans. It is, in Dylan Thomas's phrase, the force that through the green fuse drives the flower, and is present even in lifeless materials like stone or metal as the energy that holds the object together, the internal tension that makes a stone a stone. All objects are thus a compound of lifeless substance and vital force. When Marcus refers, to cause and material he means the two elements of these compounds, inert substance and animating pneuma, which are united so long as the object itself exists. When the object perishes, the pneuma that animated it is reabsorbed into the logos as a whole. This process of destruction and reintegration happens to individual objects at every moment. It also happens on a larger scale to the entire universe, which at vast intervals is entirely consumed by fire, a process known as ekpyrosis, and then regenerated. If the world is indeed orderly, if the logos controls all things, then the order it produces should be discernible in all aspects of it. Stoics speculate about the nature of the physical world, but also motivated them to seek the rationality characteristic of the logos in other areas, notably in formal logic and the nature and structure of language. Their interest in etymology is reflected in several entries in the Meditations. Was not only intellectual but also geographical. The Romans of the 2nd century BC were in the midst of a course of conquest that by the end of the century would leave them the effective masters of the Mediterranean. With conquest came culture. Looking back on the rapid Hellenization of the Roman aristocracy between 200 BC, Painidius, c. 185–109 BC, and Posidonius, c. 135–50 BC, visited Rome to lecture. It became the fashion for young upper-class Romans to study in Athens. Roman aristocrats acted as patrons to individual philosophers and assembled large libraries of philosophical texts. Romans like Cicero and Lucretius attempted to expound Greek philosophical doctrines in Latin. Stoics had always approved of participation in public life, and this stand struck a chord with the Roman aristocracy, whose code of values placed a premium on political and military activity. In the process it became a rather different version of the philosophy from that taught by Zeno and Chrysippus. The most important development was a shift in emphasis, a narrowing of focus. Early and middle Stoicism was a holistic system. It aimed to embrace all knowledge, and its focus was speculative and theoretical. Roman Stoicism, by contrast, was a practical discipline, not an abstract system of thought, but an attitude to life. Partly for historical reasons, it is this Romanized Stoicism that has most influenced later generations. Stoicism in its later form was a system inspired as much by individuals as by texts or doctrines. One of its most distinguished adherents was Marcus Cato, a senator of renowned rectitude. When Julius Caesar marched on Rome in 49 BC, Cato sided with Caesar's rival Pompey in defense of the legitimate government. When it was clear that Caesar would triumph, Cato chose not to survive the Republic, killing himself after the Battle of Munda in 46. Within a century he had become an emblem of Stoic resistance to tyranny. Under Nero he was immortalized by the poet Lucan and praised in a laudatory biography by the senator Thrasea Paetus, whose own resistance to Nero cost him his life. Thrasea and Helvidius in their turn served as role models to 2nd century aristocrats like Marcus's mentors Rusticus, Maximus, and Severus. Marcus himself pays tribute to them, and to Cato, in Meditations 1.14. Cato, Thrasea, and Helvidius were doers, not writers, and their legendary heroism inevitably lends them a somewhat two-dimensional quality. A more complex and much more interesting figure was the poet Lucan's uncle, Lucius Annius Seneca, c. 4b.c. a.d. 65, commonly known as Seneca the Younger. Originally counselor to the young Nero, he was eventually forced to commit suicide after being implicated in an attempted coup against his erstwhile pupil. Yet his works, in particular the letters to Lucilius, remain the most engaging and accessible expressions of later Stoicism. There was another kind of Stoic exemplar as well, the outsider whose ascetic lifestyle won him the admiration of his wealthier contemporaries and enabled him to criticize the pretenses of upper-class society with real authority. Like Gaius Musonius Rufus, c. 30–100, a member of the Roman administrative class, the so-called knights, equites, who was banished by both Nero and Vespasian. Musonius's student Epictetus, c. 55, c. 135, who had taken up the practice of philosophy as a slave and devoted the remainder of his life to it after being freed. He had been exiled to Nicopolis, in northern Greece, under Domitian, and after the tyrant's death, elected to remain there, where he taught and lectured to visitors who often traveled great distances to study with him. Arrian, c. 86–160, who published an extensive record of the master's discussions, Discourses of Epictetus. Epictetus seems to have been an especially important figure for Marcus. Stoicism and the Meditations. The late Stoicism of Epictetus is a radically stripped-down version of its Hellenistic predecessor, a philosophy which had learnt much from its competitors and had almost forgotten parts of itself. Chrysippus and his followers had divided knowledge into three areas: logic, physics, and ethics, concerned, respectively, with the nature of knowledge, the structure of the physical world and the proper role of human beings in that world. But logic and physics were not his focus. In many cases Marcus's logic is weak, the logic of the rhetorician, not of the philosopher. It is rare to find a developed chain of reasoning like that in Meditations 4.4. His interest in the nature of the physical world is limited to its relevance to human problems. About one of the basic Stoic physical doctrines, the notion of the periodic conflagration, ekpyrosis, that ends a cosmic cycle, Marcus adopts an agnostic position, though he was not alone in this. To him it was ethics that was the basis of the system. Just because you've abandoned your hopes of becoming a great thinker or scientist, don't give up on attaining freedom, achieving humility, serving others. 7.67. The questions that the Meditations tries to answer are primarily metaphysical and ethical ones. Why are we here? How should we live our lives? How can we ensure that we do what is right? How can we protect ourselves against the stresses and pressures of daily life? How should we deal with pain and misfortune? How can we live with the knowledge that someday we will no longer exist? The doctrine of the three disciplines, the disciplines of perception, of action, and of the will. The discipline of perception requires that we maintain absolute objectivity of thought, that we see things dispassionately for what they are. Proper understanding of this point requires a brief introduction to the Stoic theory of cognition. We have seen that for the Stoics universal order is represented by the logos. The logos infuses and is wielded by our hegemonikon, literally, that which guides, which is the intellective part of our consciousness. In different contexts it can approximate either will or character, and it performs many of the functions that English speakers attribute to the brain or the heart. One of its primary functions is to process and assess the data we receive from our senses. At every instant the objects and events in the world around us bombard us with impressions. As they do so they produce a phantasia, a mental impression. From this the mind generates a perception, hypolepsis, which might best be compared to a print made from a photographic negative. Ideally this print will be an accurate and faithful representation of the original. But it may not be. It may be blurred, or it may include shadow images that distort or obscure the original. Chief among these are inappropriate value judgments, the designation as good or evil of things that in fact are neither good nor evil. For example, my impression that my house has just burned down is simply that an impression or report conveyed to me by my senses about an event in the outside world. By contrast, my perception that my house has burned down and I have thereby suffered a terrible tragedy includes not only an impression, but also an interpretation imposed upon that initial impression by my powers of hypolepsis. It is by no means the only possible interpretation, and I am not obliged to accept it. I may be a good deal better off if I decline to do so. It is, in other words, not objects and events but the interpretations we place on them that are the problem. Our duty is therefore to exercise stringent control over the faculty of perception, with the aim of protecting our mind from error. The second discipline, that of action, relates to our relationship with other people. Human beings, for Marcus as for the Stoics generally, are social animals. All human beings possess not only a share of the logos but also the ability to use it. That is what makes us human and distinguishes us from other animals. But it would perhaps be more accurate to say that we are participants in the logos, which is as much a process as a substance. Marcus himself more than once compares the world ruled by logos to a city in which all human beings are citizens, with all the duties inherent in citizenship. As human beings we are part of nature, and our duty is to accommodate ourselves to its demands and requirements, to live as nature requires, as Marcus often puts it. To do this we must make proper use of the logos we have been allotted, and perform as best we can the functions assigned us in the master plan of the larger, cosmic logos, of which it is a part. This requires not merely passive acquiescence in what happens, but active cooperation with the world, with fate and, above all, with other human beings. We were made, Marcus tells us over and over, not for ourselves but for others, and our nature is fundamentally unselfish. In our relationships with others we must work for their collective good, while treating them justly and fairly as individuals. Marcus never defines what he means by justice, and it is important to recognize what the term implies and what it does not. All human beings have a share of the logos, and all have roles to play in the vast design that is the world. But this is not to say that all humans are equal or that the roles they are assigned are interchangeable. Human society is a single organism, like an individual human body or a tree. But the trunk of the tree is not to be confused with the leaves, or the hands and feet with the head. Our duty to act justly does not mean that we must treat others as our equals, it means that we must treat them as they deserve. And their deserts are determined in part by their position in the hierarchy. Stoicism's emphasis on the orderliness of the universe implies a similar orderliness and harmony in its parts, and part of its appeal to upper-class Romans may have been that it did not force its adherents to ask difficult questions about the organization of the society they lived in. The third discipline, the discipline of will, is in a sense the counterpart to the second, the discipline of action. The latter governs our approach to the things in our control, those that we do. The discipline of will governs our attitude to things that are not within our control, those that we have done to us, by others or by nature. We control our own actions and are responsible for them. If we act wrongly, then we have done serious harm to ourselves, though not, it should be emphasized, to others, or to the logos. By contrast, things outside our control have no ability to harm us. Acts of wrongdoing by a human agent, torture, theft, or other crimes, harm the agent, not the victim. Acts of nature such as fire, illness, or death can harm us only if we choose to see them as harmful. When we do so, we question the benevolence and providence of the logos, and thereby degrade our own logos. This, of course, we must not do. Instead we must see things for what they are. Here the discipline of perception is relevant, and accept them, by exercising the discipline of will, or what Epictetus calls, in a phrase quoted by Marcus, the art of acquiescence. For if we recognize that all events have been foreseen by the logos and form part of its plan, and that the plan in question is unfailingly good, as it must be, then it follows that we must accept whatever fate has in store for us, however unpleasant it may appear. This applies to all obstacles and, apparent, misfortunes, and in particular to death, a process that we cannot prevent, which therefore does not harm us, and which accordingly we must accept willingly as natural and proper. E.g. Meditation 7.54, everywhere, at each moment, you have the option to accept this event with humility will, to treat this person as he should be treated action, to approach this thought with care, so that nothing irrational creeps in perception. Meditations 9.6, objective judgment, unselfish action, willing acceptance of all external events. Meditations 8.7. Progress for a rational mind means not accepting falsehood or uncertainty in its perceptions, making unselfish actions its only aim, seeking and shunning only the things it has control over, embracing what nature demands of it, the nature in which it participates, as the leaf's nature does in the trees. The almost obsessive repetition of these 3 points suggests that they lie at the very heart of Marcus's thought, and of his project in the Meditations. Other influences. Marcus Aurelius is often thought of and referred to as the quintessential Stoic. But neither Zeno nor Cleanthes is mentioned in the Meditations, and Chrysippus appears only twice, quoted once in passing for a pithy comparison, 6.42, and included with Socrates and Epictetus in a list of dead thinkers, 7.19. This is not to deny the essentially Stoic basis of Marcus's thought, most obviously Epictetus. But not Stoicism but simply philosophy. The Platonists, Peripatetics, Cynics, and Stoics preferred to focus on the points they shared, rather than those that separated them. While built on a Stoic foundation, it also refers to and quotes a wide range of figures, both precursors of the Stoics and representatives of rival schools. Of the predecessors Marcus invokes, the most important is surely Socrates, the great Athenian thinker who had helped redirect philosophy from a preoccupation with the physical world to a focus on the role of man in society and the nature of human morality. Socrates himself wrote nothing. His teachings were transmitted, and greatly elaborated, in the philosophical dialogues of his student Plato. Marcus quotes Plato repeatedly, especially in Book 7, and Socratic or Platonic elements can be discerned elsewhere too. One example is the so-called Socratic paradox, the claim that no one does wrong willingly, and that if men were able to recognize what is right, they would inevitably do it. They are like this, Marcus says of other people, because they can't tell good from evil, 2.1, and he repeats this assertion elsewhere. Socrates' character was as important as his doctrines. His refusal to compromise his philosophical beliefs led him to make the ultimate sacrifice when he was put on trial at the age of 70 on trumped-up charges of impiety. His display of integrity at the trial and his comportment in the days leading up to his execution made it easy to view him as a forerunner of first-century Stoic martyrs like Theresa Petus or Helvidius Priscus, and it is in this light that Marcus evokes him in Meditation 7.66. Of Socrates' predecessors, the so-called pre-Socratic thinkers, the most important, both for Marcus and the Stoics generally, was Heraclitus, the mysterious figure from Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey, whose Zen-like aphorisms were proverbial for their profundity and obscurity alike. Heraclitus's philosophical system ascribed a central role to logos and to fire as the primordial element. We cannot step twice into the same river, Heraclitus had said, and we see Marcus expanding on the observation, time is a river, a violent current of events, glimpsed once and already carried past us, and another follows and is gone. Marcus twice borrows the poet Empedocles' image of the self-contained soul as a perfect sphere, 8.41, 12.3, and he alludes once to the mystic doctrines of the Pythagoreans, 11.27. Several entries explore the implications of phrases attributed to Democritus, one of the inventors of the theory of atoms, which would later inspire the Hellenistic philosopher Epicurus. Neither Heraclitus nor Socrates had founded a school. That was an achievement reserved for Plato, and then for Plato's student Aristotle, who broke from his master to found the peripatetic movement. Cynicism. The Cynics, of whom the first and most notorious was the irascible Diogenes of Sinope, were united less by doctrine than by a common attitude, namely their contempt for societal institutions and a desire for a life more in accord with nature. Diogenes himself was largely responsible for the image of a philosopher as an impoverished ascetic. The philosopher without clothes evoked by Marcus at Meditations 4.30 might well be a cynic. His famous claim to be a citizen of the world surely anticipates, if it did not actually influence, the Stoic conception of the world as a city-state. Marcus's relationship to Epicureanism, Stoicism's great rival among Hellenistic philosophical systems, is much more vexed. The followers of Epicurus, 341 to 270 BC, believed in a universe radically unlike that posited by Zeno and Chrysippus. The Stoic world is ordered to the nth degree, the Epicurean universe is random, the product of the haphazard conjunctions of billions of atoms. To speak of providence in such a world is transparently absurd, and while Epicurus acknowledged the existence of gods, he denied that they took any interest in human life. As for humans, our role is simply to live as best we can, making the most of what pleasures are available to us and insulating ourselves as far as possible from pain and anxiety. In particular, we are to feel no anxiety about death, which consists simply in the dissolution of our component atoms. This process is not only inevitable, but harmless, for the simple reason that after death there is no us to suffer harm. The quietism endorsed by the Epicureans was obviously difficult to reconcile with an active public life, an important Roman value, and the Epicurean equation of the good with pleasure was bound to raise eyebrows among conservative Romans. Eat, drink and be merry was popularly supposed to be the Epicureans' motto, though Epicurus himself had been quite explicit in identifying pleasure with intellectual contemplation rather than the vulgar enjoyment of food and sex. Marcus normally seems to view Epicureanism with disapproval, as we would expect. Marcus quotes with apparent approval Epicurus's account of his own exemplary conduct during an illness, 9.41, and twice seeks comfort in the philosopher's remarks on the endurance of pain, 7.33, 7.64. Like other late Stoics, Seneca is a notable example. He was willing to accept truth wherever he found it. Thus far we have been concerned with the content of the Meditations, the ethical doctrine of late Stoicism, incorporating a certain amount of Platonic and Heraclitean material, and overlaid with occasional reference to other schools and thinkers. But what of the Meditations itself? How and why was it written? Who is its audience? What kind of book is it? The Meditations, genre, structure, and style. The work was entitled to himself, Eis Heoden. Not only was it not written for publication, but Marcus clearly had no expectation that anyone but himself would ever read it. The entries include a number of cryptic references to persons or events that an ancient reader would have found as unintelligible as we do. Elsewhere Marcus reflects directly on his role as emperor, in terms that would be quite irrelevant to anyone else. From these entries and others it seems clear that the you of the text is not a generic you, but the emperor himself. The entries perhaps bear a somewhat closer resemblance to the working notes of a practicing philosopher. It suggests not a mind recording new perceptions or experimenting with new arguments, but one obsessively repeating and reframing ideas long familiar but imperfectly absorbed. They are spiritual exercises composed to provide a momentary stay against the stress and confusion of everyday life, a self-help book in the most literal sense. Meditations 5.9, where Marcus reminds himself not to think of philosophy as your instructor, but as the sponge and egg white that relieve ophthalmia as a soothing ointment. On this reading, the individual entries were composed not as a record of Marcus's thoughts or to enlighten others, but for his own use, as a means of practicing and reinforcing his own philosophical convictions. Its purpose is not to describe or reflect, let alone to meditate, but to urge, direct, and exhort. And it explains also the repetitiveness that strikes any reader of the work almost immediately, the continual circling back to the same few problems. The entries do not present new answers or novel solutions to these problems, but only familiar answers reframed. It was precisely this process of reframing and re-expressing that Marcus found helpful. The arrangement of the individual entries may or may not be Marcus's own. Book 1, which is distinguished from the rest of the work by its autobiographical nature and by the greater impression of conscious design and ordering apparent in it. It consists of 17 entries in which Marcus reflects on what he learned from various individuals in his life. These suggests deliberate arrangement, presumably by Marcus himself. If so, the short sketch of Antoninus Pius in Meditation 6.30 was the starting point for the longer memoir in 1.16. Marcus's thought does not change or develop noticeably from one book to another. Marcus wrote as a man trained in the rhetorical techniques of the 2nd century. His thoughts naturally took on the impress of his training and intellectual milieu even when he was writing for himself alone. We do find in a number of entries a kind of internal debate in which the questions or objections of an imaginary interlocutor are answered by a second, calmer voice which corrects or rebukes its errors. The first voice seems to represent Marcus's weaker, human side, the second is the voice of philosophy. Marcus's writing can be extraordinarily effective, most of all when it strikes a balance between image and idea, as in the opening of 5.23, keep in mind how fast things pass by and are gone, those that are now, and those to come. Existence flows past us like a river, the what is in constant flux, the why has 1,000 variations. Nothing is stable, not even what's right here. The infinity of past and future gapes before us, a chasm whose depths we cannot see. This particular topic, the transience of human life, the constant change that shapes and informs the world, it is one whose treatment owes as much to literary as to philosophical models, and as much to Marcus's own character as to Stoic doctrine. Recurring themes. Meditations has no unity or no relationship to Marcus's own life, for it has both. What unifies it is the recurrence of a small number of themes that surely reflect Marcus's own preoccupations. It is the points to which Marcus returns most often that offer the best insight into his character and concerns. Death is not to be feared, Marcus continually reminds himself. It is a natural process, part of the continual change that forms the world. At other points it is the ultimate consolation. Soon you will be dead, Marcus tells himself on a number of occasions, and none of it will matter, cf 4.6, 7.22, 8.2. The emphasis on the vanity and worthlessness of earthly concerns is here linked to the more general idea of transience. All things change or pass away, perish and are forgotten. This is the burden of several of the thought exercises that Marcus sets himself, to think of the court of Augustus, 8.31, of the age of Vespasian or Trajan, 4.32, the great philosophers and thinkers of the past, 6.47, all now dust and ashes. Book 6 of Homer's Iliad, in which the lives of mortals are compared to leaves that grow in the spring, flourish for a season and then fall and die, to be replaced by others, 10.34. I said to myself, alas! And will you, Servius, not restrain your grief and recall that you were born immortal? Believe me, the thought was no small consolation to me. Marcus may have been a Stoic, but he was also a Roman, influenced not only by Zeno and Chrysippus but by Homer and Virgil. Other concerns surface as well. A number of entries discuss methods of dealing with pain or bodily weakness of other sorts. A persistent motif is the need to restrain anger and irritation with other people, to put up with their incompetence or malice, to show them the errors of their ways. Several entries focus on the frustrations of life at court, nowhere more present than when Marcus tells himself to stop complaining about them, 8.9. A more subtle clue to Marcus's personality is the imagery that he prefers. It is worth noting, for example, how many images of nature occur in the Meditations. The image of society as a tree whose branches are individual human beings expresses an important Stoic principle. You can see the difference between the branch that's been there since the beginning, remaining on the tree and growing with it, and the one that's been cut off and grafted back. Affection for the natural world contrasts with a persistent sense of disgust and contempt for human life and other human beings, a sense that it is difficult to derive from, or even reconcile with, Stoicism. As P.A. Brunt puts it, reason told Marcus that the world was good beyond improvement, and yet it constantly appeared to him evil beyond remedy. One of the most frequently recurring points in the Meditations is the reminder that human beings are social animals, as if this was a point Marcus had a particularly hard time accepting. The gods care for mortals, he reminds himself, and you on the verge of death you still refuse to care for them. There is a persistent strain of pessimism in the work. The things we want in life are empty, stale, and trivial. Dogs snarling at each other. Quarreling children laughing and then bursting into tears a moment later. Trust, shame, justice, truth gone from the earth and only found in heaven. Why are you still here? 5.33. Images of dirt appear in several entries. And the objective analysis Marcus prizes often shades over into a depressing cynicism, in the modern sense of the term. As one scholar has observed, reading the Meditations for long periods can be conducive of melancholy. And even those who love the book cannot deny that there is something impoverishing about the view of human life it presents. Marcus does not offer us a means of achieving happiness, but only a means of resisting pain. One can imagine that they might have had special meaning for an emperor whose last years were spent in warfare and a journey far from home, 2.17. For Marcus, life was a battle, and often it must have seemed what in some sense it must always be a losing battle. From a Stoic perspective, of course, God, or the gods are merely conventional terms for what we might equally well call nature or the logos or providence, or simply how things are. Marcus stresses the benevolence of this power. What is divine must be good, surely, but it is clear that he also ascribes to its actions the implacability with which orthodox Stoic doctrine endows it. It is not easy to see why one should pray to a power whose decisions one can hardly hope to influence, and indeed Marcus several times seems to admit the possibility that one should not, 5.7, 6.44, 9.40. It is all the more surprising, then, to find Marcus elsewhere suggesting a more personal concern on the gods' part. The final entry of Book 1 is the most obvious example. Here Marcus indicates that the gods have aided him quite directly through their gifts, their help, their inspiration, just as they have others, cf 9.11. The gods also assist other people, he reminds himself. Marcus himself did believe deeply in the gods, not merely as a figure of speech but as a real force in his own life, is suggested by his refutation of those who doubt their existence. How was this personal relationship with the divine to be reconciled with the impersonal logos of the Stoics? The question seems to be played out in the dialogue at Meditations 9.40. But those are things the gods left up to me, protests one voice, to which another responds, and what makes you think the gods don't care about what's up to us? Marcus himself may not have fully recognized or acknowledged this conflict, but its existence may point to a half-conscious awareness that the answer Stoicism offered was not in every respect satisfactory. Later influence. How or by whom the Meditations was preserved is unknown. For the next 1,000 years Marcus's work, like that of Homer and Euripides, would remain unknown to Western readers. For centuries, all trace of it is lost, until at the beginning of the 10th century it reappears in a letter from the scholar and churchman Aurelius, who writes to a friend, "I have had for a while now a copy of the Emperor Marcus's invaluable book. It was not only old but practically coming apart. I have had it copied and can now pass it on to posterity in better shape." Whether Aurelius's copy was indeed responsible for the work's survival we do not know. At any rate, its readership seems to have increased in the centuries that followed. The fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453 led to an exodus of scholars, bringing with them the Greek texts that inspired the Italian Renaissance. The Meditations must have been among them. The only complete manuscript to survive is a 14th century codex, now in the Vatican, which is riddled with errors. The first printed edition did not appear until 1559, when Wilhelm Holzmann, known as Xylander, produced a text from what seems to have been a more reliable manuscript. The Meditations has never attracted great interest from professional students of the classics, and the reasons are perhaps understandable. It contains few direct references to historical events and provides relatively little material for social historians. As evidence for later Stoicism it pales beside the greater bulk of Epictetus's discourses. Introduction notes. 2 examples are worth pointing to. Marcus finds the gladiatorial combat and the brutal executions of the arena a source of tedium. 6.46, that they might be morally wrong seems never to have occurred to him. He prides himself on not having taken sexual advantage of his slaves, not because it would have been harmful or unjust to them, but because such self-indulgence would have been damaging to his own character. 1.17. Book 1. Debts and Lessons. 7 Rusticus. The recognition that I needed to train and discipline my character. Not to be sidetracked by my interest in rhetoric. Not to write treatises on abstract questions, or deliver moralizing little sermons, or compose imaginary descriptions of the simple life or the man who lives only for others. And to behave in a conciliatory way when people who have angered or annoyed us want to make up. To read attentively, not to be satisfied with just getting the gist of it. And not to fall for every smooth talker. 8 Apollonius. And to be the same in all circumstances. Intense pain, the loss of a child, chronic illness. A man can show both strength and flexibility. And to have learned how to accept favors from friends without losing your self-respect or appearing ungrateful. 9 Sixtus. To show intuitive sympathy for friends, tolerance to amateurs and sloppy thinkers. His ability to get along with everyone, sharing his company was the highest of compliments, and the opportunity and honor for those around him. To investigate and analyze, with understanding and logic, the principles we ought to live by. Not to display anger or other emotions. To be free of passion and yet full of love. To praise without bombast, to display expertise without pretension. 10 The literary critic Alexander. Not to be constantly correcting people, and in particular not to jump on them whenever they make an error of usage or a grammatical mistake or mispronounce something, but just answer their question or add another example, or debate the issue itself, not their phrasing, or make some other contribution to the discussion and insert the right expression, unobtrusively. 11 Fronto. To recognize the malice, cunning, and hypocrisy that power produces, and the peculiar ruthlessness often shown by people from good families. 12 Alexander the Platonist. Not to be always ducking my responsibilities to the people around me because of pressing business. 13 Catullus. Not to shrug off a friend's resentment, even unjustified resentment, but try to put things right. To show your teachers ungrudging respect, the Domitius and Athenodotus story, and your children unfeigned love. 14 My brother Severus. A society of equal laws, governed by equality of status and of speech, and of rulers who respect the liberty of their subjects above all else. And to help others and be eager to share, not to be a pessimist, and never to doubt your friend's affection for you. 15 Maximus. Self-control and resistance to distractions. Optimism in adversity, especially illness. A personality in balance, dignity and grace together. Doing your job without whining. Other people's certainty that what he said was what he thought, and what he did was done without malice. Never taken aback or apprehensive. Neither rash nor hesitant or bewildered, or at a loss. Not obsequious but not aggressive or paranoid. Either. Generosity, charity, honesty. The sense he gave of staying on the path rather than being kept on it. That no one could ever have felt patronized by him or in a position to patronize him. 16. My adopted father. Indifference to superficial honors. Hard work. Persistence. Listening to anyone who could contribute to the public good. His dogged determination to treat people as they deserved. A sense of when to push and when to back off. Putting a stop to the pursuit of boys. His altruism. Not expecting his friends to keep him entertained at dinner or to travel with him, unless they wanted to. And anyone who had to stay behind to take care of something always found him the same when he returned. His searching questions at meetings. A kind of single-mindedness, almost, never content with first impressions, or breaking off the discussion prematurely. His constancy to friends never getting fed up with them, or playing favorites. Self-reliance, always. And cheerfulness. And his advance planning, well in advance, and his discreet attention to even minor things. His restrictions on acclamations and all attempts to flatter him. His willingness to take responsibility and blame for both. His attitude to men, no demagoguery, no currying favor, no pandering. Always sober, always steady, and never vulgar or a prey to fads. The way he handled the material comforts that fortune had supplied him in such abundance without arrogance and without apology. If they were there, he took advantage of them. If not, he didn't miss them. No one ever called him glib, or shameless, or pedantic. They saw him for what he was, a man tested by life, accomplished, unswayed by flattery, qualified to govern both himself and them. Without denigrating the others or listening to them. His ability to feel at ease with people and put them at their ease, without being pushy. His willingness to take adequate care of himself. Not a hypochondriac or obsessed with his appearance, but not ignoring things either. His willingness to yield the floor to experts in oratory, law, psychology, whatever, and to support them energetically, so that each of them could fulfill his potential. Sticking with the same old places and the same old things. The way he could have one of his migraines and then go right back to what he was doing fresh and at the top of his game. The way he kept public actions within reasonable bounds because he looked to what needed doing and not the credit to be gained from doing it. No bathing at strange hours, no self-indulgent building projects, no concern for food, or the cut and color of his clothes. He never exhibited rudeness, lost control of himself, or turned violent. No one ever saw him sweat. Everything was to be approached logically and with due consideration, in a calm and orderly fashion but decisively, and with no loose ends. He knew how to enjoy and abstain from things that most people find it hard to abstain from and all too easy to enjoy. Strength, perseverance, self-control in both areas, the mark of a soul in readiness indomitable. Maximus's illness. 17. The gods. That I had good grandparents, a good mother and father, a good sister, good teachers, good servants, relatives, friends almost without exception. And that I never lost control of myself with any of them. That I didn't lose my virginity too early, and didn't enter adulthood until it was time put it off, even. That I had someone as a ruler and as a father who could keep me from being arrogant and make me realize that even at court you can live without a troop of bodyguards, and gorgeous clothes, lamps, sculpture. A brother who challenged me to improve my own. That my children weren't born stupid or physically deformed. If I'd felt that I was making better progress I might never have given them up. That I was shown clearly and often what it would be like to live as nature requires. The gods did all they could through their gifts, their help, their inspiration to ensure that I could live as nature demands. And if I failed, it's no one's fault but mine. Because I didn't pay attention to what they told me, to what they taught me, practically, step by step. That I never laid a finger on Benedicta or on Theodotus. And that even later, when I was overcome by passion, I recovered from it. That even though I was often upset with Rusticus I never did anything I would have regretted later. That whenever I felt like helping someone who was short of money, or otherwise in need, I never had to be told that I had no resources to do it with. And that I was never put in that position myself of having to take something from someone else. That when I became interested in philosophy I didn't fall into the hands of charlatans, and didn't get bogged down in writing treatises, or become absorbed by logic shopping, or preoccupied with physics. Book 2. On the River Gran, among the Quadi. 1. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good, and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me. No one can implicate me in ugliness. Nor can I feel angry at my relative, or hate him. We were born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes, like the 2 rows of teeth, upper and lower. To obstruct each other is unnatural. To feel anger at someone, to turn your back on him, these are obstructions. To whatever this is that I am, it is flesh and a little spirit and an intelligence. Throw away your books, stop letting yourself be distracted. Consider what the spirit is, air, and never the same air, but vomited out and gulped in again every instant. Finally, the intelligence. Think of it this way, you are an old man. Stop allowing your mind to be a slave, to be jerked about by selfish impulses, to kick against fate and the present, and to mistrust the future. 3. What is divine is full of providence. Even chance is not divorced from nature, from the inweaving and enfolding of things governed by providence. The world is maintained by change in the elements and in the things they compose. That should be enough for you, treat it as an axiom. Discard your thirst for books, so that you won't die in bitterness, but in cheerfulness and truth, grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. For remember how long you've been putting this off, how many extensions the gods gave you, and you didn't use them. At some point you have to recognize what world it is that you belong to, what power rules it and from what source you spring, that there is a limit to the time assigned you, and if you don't use it to free yourself it will be gone and will never return. 5. Concentrate every minute like a Roman, like a man, on doing what's in front of you with precise and genuine seriousness, tenderly, willingly, with justice. If you do everything as if it were the last thing you were doing in your life, and stop being aimless, stop letting your emotions override what your mind tells you, stop being hypocritical, self-centered, irritable. You see how few things you have to do to live a satisfying and reverent life. If you can manage this, that's all even the gods can ask of you. 6. Yes, keep on degrading yourself, soul. But soon your chance at dignity will be gone. Everyone gets one life. Yours is almost used up, and instead of treating yourself with respect, you have entrusted your own happiness to the souls of others. 7. Do external things distract you? Then make time for yourself to learn something worthwhile. Stop letting yourself be pulled in all directions. People who labor all their lives but have no purpose to direct every thought and impulse toward are wasting their time even when hard at work. 8. Ignoring what goes on in other people's souls. No one ever came to grief that way. But if you won't keep track of what your own soul's doing, how can you not be unhappy? 9. Don't ever forget these things. How I relate to the world. What proportion of it I make up. That you are part of nature, and no one can prevent you from speaking and acting in harmony with it, always. 10. In comparing sins, the ones committed out of desire are worse than the ones committed out of anger. Theophrastus. The angry man seems to turn his back on reason out of a kind of pain and inner convulsion. But the man motivated by desire, who is mastered by pleasure, seems somehow more self-indulgent, less manly in his sins. The sin committed out of pleasure deserves a harsher rebuke than the one committed out of pain. The angry man is more like a victim of wrongdoing, provoked by pain to anger. The other man rushes into wrongdoing on his own, moved to action by desire. 11. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. If the gods exist, then to abandon human beings is not frightening, the gods would never subject you to harm. And if they don't exist, or don't care what happens to us, what would be the point of living in a world without gods or providence? But they do exist, they do care what happens to us, and everything a person needs to avoid real harm they have placed within him. If it doesn't harm your character, how can it harm your life? Nor would it ever, through inability or incompetence, make such a mistake as to let good and bad things happen indiscriminately to good and bad alike. But death and life, success and failure, pain and pleasure, wealth and poverty, all these happen to good and bad alike, and they are neither noble nor shameful and hence neither good nor bad. 12. The speed with which all of them vanish, the objects in the world, and the memory of them in time. To understand those things, how stupid, contemptible, grimy, decaying, and dead they are, that's what our intellectual powers are for. And what dying is, and that if you look at it in the abstract and break down your imaginary ideas of it by logical analysis, you realize that it's nothing but a process of nature, a necessary one. 13. Nothing is more pathetic than people who run around in circles, delving into the things that lie beneath and conducting investigations into the souls of the people around them, never realizing that all you have to do is to be attentive to the power inside you and worship it sincerely. What is divine deserves our respect because it is good, what is human deserves our affection because it is like us. And our pity too, sometimes, for its inability to tell good from bad, as terrible a blindness as the kind that can't tell white from black. 14. Even if you're going to live 3,000 more years, or 10 times that, remember, you cannot lose another life than the one you're living now, or live another one than the one you're losing. For you can't lose either the past or the future. How could you lose what you don't have? Remember two things. That everything has always been the same, and keeps recurring, and it makes no difference whether you see the same things recur in 100 years or 200, or in an infinite period. 2. That the longest lived and those who will die soonest lose the same thing. The present is all that they can give up, since that is all you have, and what you do not have, you cannot lose. 15. Everything is just an impression. Monimus the cynic. And the response is obvious enough. But the point is a useful one, if you take it for what it's worth. 16. The human soul degrades itself. Above all, when it does its best to become an abscess, a kind of detached growth on the world. To be disgruntled at anything that happens is a kind of secession from nature, which comprises the nature of all things. 2. When it turns its back on another person or sets out to do it harm, as the souls of the angry do. 3. When it is overpowered by pleasure or pain. 4. When it puts on a mask and does or says something artificial or false. When it allows its action and impulse to be without a purpose, to be random and disconnected, even the smallest things ought to be directed toward a goal. But the goal of rational beings is to follow the rule and law of the most ancient of communities and states. 17. Human life. Duration, momentary. Nature, changeable. Perception, dim. Condition of body, decaying. Soul, spinning around. Fortune, unpredictable. Lasting fame, uncertain. Sum up, the body and its parts are a river, the soul a dream and mist, life is warfare and a journey far from home, lasting reputation is oblivion. Then what can guide us? Only philosophy. Which means making sure that the power within stays safe and free from assault, superior to pleasure and pain, doing nothing randomly or dishonestly and with imposture, not dependent on anyone else's doing something or not doing it. And making sure that it accepts what happens and what it is dealt as coming from the same place it came from. Accept death in a cheerful spirit, as nothing but the dissolution of the elements from which each living thing is composed. If it doesn't hurt the individual elements to change continually into one another, why are people afraid of all of them changing and separating? It's a natural thing. And nothing natural is evil. Book 3. Incarnantum. 1. Not just that every day more of our life is used up and less of it is left, but this too, if we live longer, can we be sure our mind will still be up to understanding the world to the contemplation that aims at divine and human knowledge? But getting the most out of ourselves, calculating where our duty lies, analyzing what we hear and see, deciding whether it's time to call it quits, all the things you need a healthy mind for. All those are gone. So we need to hurry. Not just because we move daily closer to death, but also because our understanding, our grasp of the world may be gone before we get there. 2. We should remember that even nature's inadvertence has its own charm, its own attractiveness. If you look at them in isolation, there's nothing beautiful about them, and yet by supplementing nature they enrich it and draw us in. And anyone with a feeling for nature, a deeper sensitivity, will find it all gives pleasure. He'll find the jaws of live animals as beautiful as painted ones or sculptures. He'll look calmly at the distinct beauty of old age in men, women, and at the loveliness of children. Things seen only by those at home with nature and its works. 3. Hippocrates cured many illnesses and then fell ill and died. The Chaldeans predicted the deaths of many others, in due course their own hour arrived. Democritus was killed by ordinary vermin, Socrates by the humankind. And you boarded, you set sail, you've made the passage. Time to disembark. If it's for another life, well, there's nowhere without God's on that side either. If to nothingness, then you no longer have to put up with pain and pleasure, or go on dancing attendance on this battered crate, your body so much inferior to that which serves it. One is mind and spirit, the other earth and garbage. 4. Don't waste the rest of your time here worrying about other people unless it affects the common good. It will keep you from doing anything useful. You'll be too preoccupied with what so and so is doing, and why, and what they're saying, and what they're thinking, and what they're up to, and all the other things that throw you off and keep you from focusing on your own mind. You need to avoid certain things in your train of thought, everything random, everything irrelevant. And certainly everything self-important or malicious. You need to get used to winnowing your thoughts, so that if someone says, "What are you thinking about?" you can respond at once, and truthfully, that you are thinking this or thinking that. And it would be obvious at once from your answer that your thoughts were straightforward and considerate ones, the thoughts of an unselfish person, one unconcerned with pleasure and with sensual indulgence generally, with squabbling, with slander and envy, or anything else you'd be ashamed to be caught thinking. Someone like that, in touch with what is within him and what keeps a person undefiled by pleasures, invulnerable to any pain, untouched by arrogance, unaffected by meanness, an athlete in the greatest of all contests, the struggle not to be overwhelmed by anything that happens. With what leaves us dyed indelibly by justice, welcoming wholeheartedly whatever comes, whatever we're assigned, not worrying too often, or with any selfish motive, about what other people say, or do, or think. He does only what is his to do, and considers constantly what the world has in store for him, doing his best, and trusting that all is for the best. For we carry our fate with us and it carries us. He keeps in mind that all rational things are related, and that to care for all human beings is part of being human. Which doesn't mean we have to share their opinions. We should listen only to those whose lives conform to nature. And the others? He bears in mind what sort of people they are. And he cares nothing for their praise, men who can't even meet their own standards. 5. How to act. Never under compulsion, out of selfishness, without forethought, with misgivings. Don't gussy up your thoughts. No surplus words or unnecessary actions. Let the spirit in you represent a man, an adult, a citizen, a Roman, a ruler. Taking up his post like a soldier and patiently awaiting his recall from life. Needing no oath or witness. Cheerfulness. Without requiring other people's help. Or serenity supplied by others. To stand up straight, not straightened. 6. If, at some point in your life, you should come across anything better than justice, honesty, self-control, courage, than a mind satisfied that it has succeeded in enabling you to act rationally, and satisfied to accept what's beyond its control, if you find anything better than that, embrace it without reservations. It must be an extraordinary thing indeed, and enjoy it to the full. If you find that there's nothing more important or valuable than that, then don't make room for anything but it, for anything that might lead you astray, tempt you off the road, and leave you unable to devote yourself completely to achieving the goodness that is uniquely yours. It would be wrong for anything to stand between you and attaining goodness as a rational being and a citizen. Anything at all, the applause of the crowd, high office, wealth, or self-indulgence. All of them might seem to be compatible with it for a while. But suddenly they control us and sweep us away. So make your choice straightforwardly, once and for all, and stick to it. Choose what's best. Best is what benefits me. As a rational being? Then follow through. Or just as an animal? Then say so and stand your ground without making a show of it. Just make sure you've done your homework first. 7. Never regard something as doing you good if it makes you betray a trust, or lose your sense of shame, or makes you show hatred, suspicion, ill will, or hypocrisy, or a desire for things best done behind closed doors. If you can privilege your own mind, your guiding spirit, and your reverence for its powers, that should keep you clear of dramatics, of wailing and gnashing of teeth. Above all, you'll be free of fear and desire. And how long your body will contain the soul that inhabits it will cause you not a moment's worry. If it's time for you to go, leave willingly as you would to accomplish anything that can be done with grace and honor. And concentrate on this, your whole life long, for your mind to be in the right state, the state a rational, civic mind should be in. 8. The mind of one set straight and purified, no pus, no dirt, no scabs. And not a life cut short by death, like an actor who stops before the play is done, the plot wound up. Neither servility nor arrogance. Neither cringing nor disdain. Neither excuses nor evasions. 9. Your ability to control your thoughts, treat it with respect. It's all that protects your mind from false perceptions false to your nature, and that of all rational beings. It's what makes thoughtfulness possible, and affection for other people, and submission to the divine. 10. Forget everything else. Keep hold of this alone and remember it, each of us lives only now, this brief instant. The rest has been lived already, or is impossible to see. The span we live is small as the corner of the earth in which we live it. Ignorant alike of themselves and those long dead. 11. To the standbys above, add this one, always to define whatever it is we perceive, to trace its outline so we can see what it really is, its substance. Nothing is so conducive to spiritual growth as this capacity for logical and accurate analysis of everything that happens to us. What is it, this thing that now forces itself on my notice? What is it made up of? How long was it designed to last? And what qualities do I need to bring to bear on it? Tranquility, courage, honesty, trustworthiness, straightforwardness, independence, or what? So in each case you need to say, this is due to God. Or, this is due to the interweavings and intertwinings of fate, to coincidence, or chance. Or, this is due to a human being. Someone of the same race, the same birth, the same society, but who doesn't know what nature requires of him. But I do. And so I'll treat them as the law that binds us, the law of nature requires. With kindness and with justice. And in inconsequential things, I'll do my best to treat them as they deserve. 12. If you do the job in a principled way, with diligence, energy, and patience, if you keep yourself free of distractions, and keep the spirit inside you undamaged, as if you might have to give it back at any moment. If you can embrace this without fear or expectation, can find fulfillment in what you're doing now, as nature intended, and in superhuman truthfulness, every word, every utterance, then your life will be happy. No one can prevent that. 13. Doctors keep their scalpels and other instruments handy, for emergencies. Keep your philosophy ready to understand heaven and earth. In everything you do, even the smallest thing, remember the chain that links them. Nothing earthly succeeds by ignoring heaven, nothing heavenly by ignoring the earth. 14. Stop drifting. You're not going to reread your brief comments, your deeds of the ancient Greeks and Romans, the commonplace books you saved for your old age. Sprint for the finish. Write off your hopes, and if your well-being matters to you, be your own savior while you can. 15. They don't realize how much is included in stealing, sowing, buying, resting, seeing to business, not with the eyes, but another kind of sight. 16. Body. Soul. Mind. Sensations, the body. Desires, the soul. Reasoning, the mind. To experience sensations, even grazing beasts do that. To let your desires control you, even wild animals do that, and rutting humans, and tyrants, from Phalaris to Nero. To make your mind your guide to what seems best, even people who deny the gods do that. Even people who betray their country. Even people who do, behind closed doors. If all the rest is common coin, then what is unique to the good man? To welcome with affection what is sent by fate. Not to stain or disturb the spirit within him with a mess of false beliefs. Instead, to preserve it faithfully, by calmly obeying God, saying nothing untrue, doing nothing unjust. And if the others don't acknowledge it, this life lived with simplicity, humility, cheerfulness, he doesn't resent them for it, and isn't deterred from following the road where it leads, to the end of life. An end to be approached in purity, in serenity, in acceptance, in peaceful unity with what must be. Book 4. 1. Our inward power, when it obeys nature, reacts to events by accommodating itself to what it faces, to what is possible. 2. No random actions, none not based on underlying principles. 3. People try to get away from it all. Which is idiotic. You can get away from it anytime you like. By going within. Nowhere you can go is more peaceful, more free of interruptions than your own soul. Complete tranquility. And by tranquility I mean a kind of harmony. What's there to complain about? People's misbehavior? But take into consideration that rational beings exist for one another. That doing what's right sometimes requires patience. And the number of people who have feuded and envied and hated and fought and died and been buried. And keep your mouth shut. Or is it your body? Keep in mind that when the mind detaches itself and realizes its own nature, it no longer has anything to do with ordinary life, the rough and the smooth, either one. And remember all you've been taught and accepted about pain and pleasure. Or is it your reputation that's bothering you? But look at how soon we're all forgotten. The abyss of endless time that swallows it all. The whole earth a point in space and most of it uninhabited. So keep this refuge in mind, the back roads of yourself. Above all, no strain and no stress. Be straightforward. Look at things like a man, like a human being, like a citizen, like a mortal. And among the things you turn to, these two. That things have no hold on the soul. They stand there unmoving, outside. Disturbance comes only from within, from our own perceptions. 2. That everything you see will soon alter and cease to exist. Think of how many changes you've already seen. The world is nothing but change. Our life is only perception. 4. If thought is something we share, then so is reason what makes us reasoning beings. If so, then the reason that tells us what to do and what not to do is also shared. And if so, we share a common law. And thus, are fellow citizens. And fellow citizens of something. And in that case, our state must be the world. What other entity could all of humanity belong to? And from the state that we share come thought and reason and law. Where else could they come from? The earth that composes me derives from earth, the water from some other element, the air from its own source, the heat and fire from theirs, since nothing comes from nothing, or returns to it. So thought must derive from somewhere else as well. 5. Death, something like birth, a natural mystery, elements that split and recombine. Not an embarrassing thing. Not an offense to reason, or our nature. 6. Anyway, before very long you'll both be dead and soon forgotten. 7. Choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed and you haven't been. 8. It can ruin your life only if it ruins your character. Otherwise it cannot harm you inside or out. 10. That every event is the right one. Look closely and you'll see. Not just the right one overall, but right. As if someone had weighed it out with scales. Keep looking closely like that, and embody it in your actions. Goodness, what defines a good person? Keep to it in everything you do. 12. 2 kinds of readiness are constantly needed. To do only what the logos of authority and law directs, with the good of human beings in mind. 2. To reconsider your position, when someone can set you straight or convert you to his. But your conversion should always rest on a conviction that it's right, or benefits others, nothing else. Not because it's more appealing or more popular. 13. You have a mind? Yes. Well, why not use it? Isn't that all you want for it to do its job? 14. You have functioned as a part of something, you will vanish into what produced you. Or be restored, rather, to the logos from which all things spring. By being changed. 15. Many lumps of incense on the same altar. One crumbles now, one later, but it makes no difference. 16. Now they see you as a beast, a monkey. but in a week they'll think you're a god if you rediscover your beliefs and honor the logos. 17. Not to live as if you had endless years ahead of you. Death overshadows you. While you're alive and able, be good. 18. The tranquility that comes when you stop caring what they say, or think, or do. Only what you do. Is this fair? Is this the right thing to do? Not to be distracted by their darkness. To run straight for the finish line, unswerving. 19. People who are excited by posthumous fame forget that the people who remember them will soon die too. And those after them in turn. What use is praise, except to make your lifestyle a little more comfortable? You're out of step neglecting the gifts of nature to hand on someone's words in the future. 20. Beautiful things of any kind are beautiful in themselves and sufficient to themselves. Praise is extraneous. The object of praise remains what it was, no better and no worse. Does anything genuinely beautiful need supplementing? No more than justice does, or truth, or kindness, or humility. 21. If our souls survive, how does the air find room for them, all of them, since the beginning of time? How does the earth find room for all the bodies buried in it since the beginning of time? They linger for whatever length of time, and then, through change and decomposition, make room for others. So too with the souls that inhabit the air. They linger a little, and then are changed, diffused and kindled into fire, absorbed into the logos from which all things spring, and so make room for new arrivals. How is the truth of this determined? Through analysis, material and cause. 22. Not to be driven this way and that, but always to behave with justice and see things as they are. 23. To the world, your harmony is mine. Whatever time you choose is the right time. Not late, not early. To nature, what the turn of your seasons brings me falls like ripe fruit. All things are born from you, exist in you, return to you. 24. If you seek tranquility, do less. Or, more accurately, do what's essential, what the logos of a social being requires, and in the requisite way. Which brings a double satisfaction, to do less, better. Because most of what we say and do is not essential. If you can eliminate it, you'll have more time, and more tranquility. Ask yourself at every moment, is this necessary? But we need to eliminate unnecessary assumptions as well. To eliminate the unnecessary actions that follow. 25. And then you might see what the life of the good man is like, someone content with what nature assigns him, and satisfied with being just and kind himself. 26. You've seen that. Now look at this. Don't be disturbed. Uncomplicate yourself. Someone has done wrong. To himself. Something happens to you. Good. It was meant for you by nature, woven into the pattern from the beginning. Life is short. That's all there is to say. Get what you can from the present thoughtfully, justly. Unrestrained moderation. 29. Alien, n, one who doesn't know what the world contains. Or how it operates. Fugitive, n, one who evades his obligations to others. Blind, adjective, one who keeps the eyes of his mind shut tight. Poor, adjective, requiring others, not having the necessities of life in one's own possession. Rebel, n, one who is rebellious, one who withdraws from the logos of nature because he resents its workings. It produced you, now it produces this. Schismatic, n, one who separates his own soul from others with the logos. They should be one. 31. Love the discipline you know, and let it support you. Entrust everything willingly to the gods, and then make your way through life no one's master and no one's slave. 32. The age of Vespasian, for example. People doing the exact same things, marrying, raising children, getting sick, dying, waging war, throwing parties, doing business, farming, flattering, boasting, distrusting, plotting, hoping others will die, complaining about their own lives, falling in love, putting away money, seeking high office and power. And that life they led is nowhere to be found. See how many others gave their all and soon died and decomposed into the elements that formed them. Those who worked in vain, who failed to do what they should have remained fixed on and found satisfaction in. A key point to bear in mind, the value of attentiveness varies in proportion to its object. You're better off not giving the small things more time than they deserve. 33. Everything fades so quickly, turns into legend, and soon oblivion covers it. And those are the ones who shone. The rest unknown, unasked for a minute after death. What is eternal fame? Emptiness. Then what should we work for? Only this, proper understanding, unselfish action, truthful speech. A resolve. To accept whatever happens as necessary and familiar, flowing like water from that same source and spring. 34. Hand yourself over to Clotho voluntarily, and let her spin you into whatever she pleases. 35. Everything transitory, the knower and the known. 36. Constant awareness that everything is born from change. The knowledge that there is nothing nature loves more than to alter what exists and make new things like it. All that exists is the seed of what will emerge from it. 37 On the verge of dying and still weighed down, still turbulent, still convinced external things can harm you, still rude to other people, still not acknowledging the truth, that wisdom is justice. 39 Nothing that goes on in anyone else's mind can harm you. Nor can the shifts and changes in the world around you. Then where is harm to be found? In your capacity to see it? Stop doing that and everything will be fine. Let the part of you that makes that judgment keep quiet even if the body it's attached to is stabbed or burnt, or stinking with pus, or consumed by cancer. It needs to realize that what happens to everyone bad and good alike is neither good nor bad. That what happens in every life lived naturally or not is neither natural nor unnatural. 40 The world as a living being, one nature, one soul. And how everything feeds into that single experience, moves with a single motion. And how everything helps produce everything else. Spun and woven together. 41 A little wisp of soul carrying a corpse. Epictetus. 42 There is nothing bad in undergoing change or good in emerging from it. 43 Time is a river, a violent current of events, glimpsed once and already carried past us, and another follows and is gone. 44 Everything that happens is as simple and familiar as the rose in spring, the fruit in summer, disease, death, blasphemy, conspiracy. Everything that makes stupid people happy or angry. 45 What follows coheres with what went before. Not like a random catalogue whose order is imposed upon it arbitrarily, but logically connected. And just as what exists is ordered and harmonious, what comes into being betrays an order too. Not a mere sequence, but an astonishing concordance. 46 Remember Heraclitus. Those who have forgotten where the road leads. They are at odds with what is all around them, the all-directing logos. And they find alien what they meet with every day. Our words and actions should not be like those of sleepers, for we act and speak in dreams as well, or of children copying their parents doing and saying only what we have been told. 47 Suppose that a god announced that you were going to die tomorrow or the day after. Unless you were a complete coward you wouldn't kick up a fuss about which day it was. What difference could it make? Now recognize that the difference between years from now and tomorrow is just as small. 48 Don't let yourself forget how many doctors have died, after furrowing their brows over how many deathbeds. How many astrologers, after pompous forecasts about others' ends. How many philosophers, after endless disquisitions on death and immortality. How many warriors, after inflicting thousands of casualties themselves. How many tyrants, after abusing the power of life and death atrociously, as if they were themselves immortal. How many whole cities have met their end. Human lives are brief and trivial. Yesterday a blob of semen, tomorrow embalming fluid, ash. To pass through this brief life as nature demands. To give it up without complaint. 49 To be like the rock that the waves keep crashing over. It stands unmoved and the raging of the sea falls still around it. 49a. It's unfortunate that this has happened. No. It's fortunate that this has happened and I've remained unharmed by it, not shattered by the present or frightened of the future. It could have happened to anyone. But not everyone could have remained unharmed by it. Why treat the one as a misfortune rather than the other as fortunate? Does what's happened keep you from acting with justice, generosity, self-control, sanity, prudence, honesty, humility, straightforwardness, and all the other qualities that allow a person's nature to fulfill itself? So remember this principle: when something threatens to cause you pain, the thing itself was no misfortune at all, to endure it and prevail is great good fortune. 50 A trite but effective tactic against the fear of death. Think of the list of people who had to be pried away from life. What did they gain by dying old? In the end, they all sleep 6 feet under. Our lifetime is so brief. And to live it out in these circumstances, among these people, in this body? Nothing to get excited about. Consider the abyss of time past, the infinite future. 3 days of life or 3 generations, what's the difference? 51 Take the shortest route, the one that nature planned to speak and act in the healthiest way. Do that, and be free of pain and stress, free of all calculation and pretension. Book 5. 1 At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of, if I'm going to do what I was born for, the things I was brought into the world to do? Or is this what I was created for? To huddle under the blankets and stay warm? But it's nicer here. So you were born to feel nice? Instead of doing things and experiencing them? Don't you see the plants, the birds, the ants and spiders and bees going about their individual tasks, putting the world in order, as best they can? And you're not willing to do your job as a human being? Why aren't you running to do what your nature demands? But we have to sleep sometime. Agreed. But nature set a limit on that, as it did on eating and drinking. And you're over the limit. You've had more than enough of that. But not of working. There you're still below your quota. You don't love yourself enough. Or you'd love your nature too, and what it demands of you. People who love what they do wear themselves down doing it, they even forget to wash or eat. When they're really possessed by what they do, they'd rather stop eating and sleeping than give up practicing their arts. Is helping others less valuable to you? Not worth your effort? 2. To shrug it all off and wipe it clean, every annoyance and distraction, and reach utter stillness. Child's play. 3. If an action or utterance is appropriate, then it's appropriate for you. Don't be put off by other people's comments and criticism. If it's right to say or do it, then it's the right thing for you to do or say. The others obey their own lead, follow their own impulses. Don't be distracted. Keep walking. Follow your own nature, and follow nature along the road they share. 5. No one could ever accuse you of being quick-witted. All right, but there are plenty of other things you can't claim you haven't got in you. Practice the virtues you can show: honesty, gravity, endurance, austerity, resignation, abstinence, patience, sincerity, moderation, seriousness, high-mindedness. Don't you see how much you have to offer beyond excuses like can't? And yet you still settle for less. You could have broken free a long way back. And then you would have been only a little slow. Not so quick on the uptake. And you need to work on that as well, that slowness. Not something to be ignored, let alone to prize. 6. Some people, when they do someone a favor, are always looking for a chance to call it in. And some aren't, but they're still aware of it, still regard it as a debt. But others don't even do that. They don't make a fuss about it. They just go on to something else, as the vine looks forward to bearing fruit again in season. We should be like that. Acting almost unconsciously. You'll wind up like the people I mentioned before, misled by plausible reasoning. Then you won't need to worry about neglecting your social duty. 9. Not to feel exasperated, or defeated, or despondent because your days aren't packed with wise and moral actions. But to get back up when you fail, to celebrate behaving like a human however imperfectly, and fully embrace the pursuit that you've embarked on. And not to think of philosophy as your instructor, but as the sponge and egg white that relieve ophthalmia. Remember, philosophy requires only what your nature already demands. What you've been after is something else, again something unnatural. But what could be preferable? That's exactly how pleasure traps us, isn't it? Wouldn't magnanimity be preferable? Or freedom? Honesty? Prudence? Piety? And is there anything preferable to thought itself, to logic, to understanding? Think of their sure-footedness. Their fluent stillness. 10. Any assessment we make is subject to alteration, just as we are ourselves. Look closely at them, how impermanent they are, how meaningless. Then look at the way the people around you behave. Even the best of them are hard to put up with, not to mention putting up with yourself. 11. What am I doing with my soul? Interrogate yourself, to find out what inhabits your so-called mind and what kind of soul you have now. A child's soul, an adolescent's, a woman's. A tyrant's soul? The soul of a predator or its prey. 12. Goodness, prudence, self-control, justice, and courage, say. If you'd internalized the conventional meaning, you'd be able to follow it perfectly. Now go a step further. Ask yourself whether we should accept as goods and should value the things we have to think of to have the line make sense, the ones whose abundance leaves their owner with no place to shed. 13. I am made up of substance and what animates it, and neither one can ever stop existing, any more than it began to. Every portion of me will be reassigned as another portion of the world, and that in turn transformed into another. Ad infinitum. NB, still holds good, even if the world goes through recurrent cycles. 15. Nothing pertains to human beings except what defines us as human. No other things can be demanded of us. They aren't proper to human nature, nor is it incomplete without them. It follows that they are not our goal, or what helps us reach it, the good. If any of them were proper to us, it would be improper to disdain or resist it. Nor would we admire people who show themselves immune to it. If the things themselves were good, it could hardly be good to give them up. But in reality, the more we deny ourselves such things, and things like them, or are deprived of them involuntarily, even the better we become. 16. The things you think about determine the quality of your mind. Your soul takes on the color of your thoughts. Color it with a run of thoughts like these. Anywhere you can lead your life, you can lead a good one. 2. Things gravitate toward what they were intended for. What things gravitate toward is their goal. A thing's goal is what benefits it, its good. A rational being's good is unselfishness. What we were born for. Things that have consciousness are higher than those that don't. And those with the logos still higher. 17. It is crazy to want what is impossible. And impossible for the wicked not to do so. 18. Nothing happens to anyone that he can't endure. The same thing happens to other people, and they weather it unharmed out of sheer obliviousness or because they want to display character. Is wisdom really so much weaker than ignorance and vanity? 19 Things have no hold on the soul. They have no access to it, cannot move or direct it. It is moved and directed by itself alone. It takes the things before it and interprets them as it sees fit. 20 In a sense, people are our proper occupation. Our job is to do them good and put up with them. But when they obstruct our proper tasks, they become irrelevant to us. Our actions may be impeded by them, but there can be no impeding our intentions or our dispositions. Because we can accommodate and adapt. 21 Honor that which is greatest in the world, that on whose business all things are employed and by whom they are governed. And honor what is greatest in yourself, the part that shares its nature with that power. All things in you as well are employed about its business, and your life is governed by it. 22 If it does not harm the community, it does not harm its members. When you think you've been injured, apply this rule. If the community isn't injured by it, neither am I. And if it is, anger is not the answer. Show the offender where he went wrong. 23 Keep in mind how fast things pass by and are gone, those that are now, and those to come. Existence flows past us like a river, the what is in constant flux, the why has 1,000 variations. Nothing is stable, not even what's right here. The infinity of past and future gapes before us, a chasm whose depths we cannot see. So it would take an idiot to feel self-importance or distress. Or any indignation, either. As if the things that irritate us lasted. 24 Remember. Matter. How tiny your share of it. Time. How brief and fleeting your allotment of it. Fate. How small a role you play in it. 25 So other people hurt me? That's their problem. Their character and actions are not mine. What is done to me is ordained by nature, what I do by my own. 26 The mind is the ruler of the soul. It should remain unstirred by agitations of the flesh, gentle and violent ones alike. When they make their way into your thoughts, through the sympathetic link between mind and body, don't try to resist the sensation. But don't let the mind start in with judgments, calling it good or bad. 27 To live with the gods. And to do that is to show them that your soul accepts what it is given and does what the Spirit requires. The Spirit God gave each of us to lead and guide us, a fragment of Himself. Which is our mind, our logos. 28. Don't be irritated at people's smell or bad breath. What's the point? With that mouth, with those armpits, they're going to produce that odor. But they have a brain. Can't they figure it out? Can't they recognize the problem? So you have a brain as well. Good for you. Then use your logic to awaken his. Show him. Make him realize it. If he'll listen, then you'll have solved the problem. Without anger. 28a. Neither player king nor prostitute. 29 You can live here as you expect to live there. And if they won't let you, you can depart life now and forfeit nothing. Until things reach that point, I'm free. No one can keep me from doing what I want. And I want what is proper to rational beings, living together. 30 The world's intelligence is not selfish. It created lower things for the sake of higher ones, and attuned the higher ones to one another. Look how it subordinates, how it connects, how it assigns each thing what each deserves, and brings the better things into alignment. 31 How have you behaved to the gods, to your parents, to your siblings, to your wife, to your children, to your teachers, to your nurses, to your friends, to your relatives, to your slaves? Have they all had from you nothing wrong and unworthy, either word or deed? Consider all that you've gone through, all that you've survived. And that the story of your life is done, your assignment complete. How many good things have you seen? How much pain and pleasure have you resisted? How many unkind people have you been kind to? 32 Why do other souls unskilled, untrained disturb the soul with skill and understanding? And which is that? The one that knows the beginning and the end, and knows the logos that runs through all things and that assigns to all a place, each in its allotted span, throughout the whole of time. 33 Soon you'll be ashes, or bones. A mere name, at most, and even that is just a sound, an echo. The things we want in life are empty, stale, and trivial. Trust, shame, justice, truth gone from the earth and only found in heaven. Why are you still here? Sensory objects are shifting and unstable, our senses dim and easily deceived, the soul itself a decoction of the blood. Fame in a world like this is worthless. And so? Wait for it patiently, annihilation or metamorphosis. And until that time comes what? Honor and revere the gods, treat human beings as they deserve, be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. Remember, nothing belongs to you but your flesh and blood, and nothing else is under your control. 34 Two characteristics shared by gods and men, and every rational creature. I not to let others hold you back. 2 To locate goodness in thinking and doing the right thing, and to limit your desires to that. 35 If this evil is not of my doing, nor the result of it, and the community is not endangered, Why should it bother me? Where's the danger for the community? 36 Not to be overwhelmed by what you imagine, but just do what you can and should. And if suffer in inessentials, not to treat that as a defeat. Bad habit. 37. I was once a fortunate man, but at some point fortune abandoned me. But true good fortune is what you make for yourself. Good fortune, good character, good intentions, and good actions.